Hello and welcome. The following video will describe a lesson plan that was developed to incorporate literature in the EFL classroom. The piece of literary work that was selected was To Women, As Far As I'm Concerned, which is a poem by D.H. Lawrence. Now, the intended audience of this lesson plan was a third year or a ninth grade public high school in Venezuela. This video and lesson plan were developed as a part of an assignment for the British Literature course at the Pedagógico de Caracas in the academic period 2019-1. The video will be divided in 3 sections. The first part will be used to study the poem and a brief analysis of it. The second part will study a brief biography of the author. And finally, the third part will be used to describe and go through the lesson plan per se. Before the analysis of the poem, first we should listen and read the poem so we have a clear idea of what we're going to be working with. So here we go.
To Women, As Far As I'm Concerned, by David Herbert Lawrence. The feelings I don't have, I don't have. The feeling I don't have, I won't say I have. The feelings you say you have, you don't have. The feelings you would like us both to have, we neither of us have. The feelings people ought to have, they never have. If people say they've got feelings, you may be pretty sure they haven't got them. So if you want either of us to feel anything at all, you'd better abandon all ideas of feelings altogether.
Now, the poem deals primarily with feelings and the expectations that, according to the title, women have about them, but also people in general. There are no clear indications of the gender of the speaker along the 8 verses of the poem. There actually isn't a lot of information other than the position the speaker has about feelings. The author seems to intentionally keep information from us, so we don't get any help from any detail hidden in the verses, other than what we are supposed to think about feelings. Now, as I said before, we could infer that the speaker is a man according to the title, but we don't get that for certain. Everything that we can actually understand is that the speaker is an adult with experience in interpersonal relationships. Now, these relationships could be of a romantic nature or just any other nature that we have. It could be a work relationship, a school or academic relationship, or just an interpersonal relationship, not necessarily romantic nature. Keeping this in mind, we could, at first glance, we could interpret that this is a poem because the author was a man and the title suggests that it is addressed to women, primarily. We could infer that the speaker is talking to a woman and that the feelings that are being described are of a romantic nature. Considering that, we could interpret that the poem describes a typical everyday discussion that a marriage could have. And in that case, we could have that the position of the speaker is very practical and it's trying to center itself on logic and not emotions. A second interpretation, however, because of the mention the author does of of people in general, when he says that if people say they have feelings, you can be sure that they haven't got them. It could be also a criticism of hypocrisy and the way people probably pretend to have feelings, but in reality they don't have them. So in that sense, there could be some social criticism and some social concern from the author that he's trying to reflect in the poem. A third interpretation, however, would have a woman as the speaker of the poem, and the receiver could be either a man or a woman. Now again, the title does suggest that it is a woman that is supposed to heed or to attend to these words. In that case, we could have many scenarios. A woman talking to another woman about feelings and how that is going to difficult her life, maybe. Or we could have probably a woman, an older woman, talking about feelings with a younger woman, probably giving her advice on how to pan out their life so that they don't have many complications around the future. However, like I said before, there isn't enough information, and all that we are left with are 8 verses that have feelings as a topic and the central idea and the subject matter, so that we get to think about feelings all around. With regards to the setting of the poem, again, we don't have a lot of information, but we could infer, because D.H. Lawrence died around 1930, we could infer that the poem is set in the decades before 1930, so that would be the early years of the 20th century. So probably it was set in England around that time. Now, according to what we read in the text, the tone is pretty honest, practical, blunt, and straightforward. Like the speaker is just giving us the information in the most subjective way. Now, according, in terms of literary resources, what we have is alliteration and repetition. The first 5 verses start with the feelings, the feelings, the feelings. So this is something that is no doubt intentionally crafted by the author so that we get a sensation maybe of repetition. Once again, like I said before, probably of a discussion between 2 people. Now the poem represents a valuable embodiment of what literature is in a general way, because it attempts to represent the society of its time in a creative and aesthetic way, and also the way the verses are written incite critical thinking from part of the readers. So it's trying to make the reader think about the subject matter, specifically in this case about feelings, and the repercussions that they could have in interpersonal relationships in general, probably in men and women relationships of a romantic nature, but also in general trying to describe interpersonal relationships in society. It is ideal to be included in a classroom, in an EFL classroom, because it could make our students think about it. It is relatively simple when it comes to the layout and the way the verses are written. There are no complicated vocabulary pieces. So it is ideal to be included in the classroom because it could incite a discussion or a debate and the different views that the students could have. So it is a perfect piece of literary work that could be included in the classroom. Regarding the author, D.H. Lawrence was born on September the 11th, 1885. So he lived through the final years of the Victorian era. He lived also through the Edwardian era, and finally until 1930 at the time of his death. During his lifetime, however, he didn't get the credit he deserved. In fact, because of these Victorian era and Edwardian era values, his works were considered to be ahead of their time because the subject matter of his work also placed human experience and human nature as the center of his works. So in certain novels, for example, he included very graphic descriptions of sexual relationships and sexual intercourse, and that led to some of his works being banned in certain countries, including the United States. A novel of his was banned for 30 years, and in England he was also considered a pornographer because of these things. And now that the time has passed, critics consider him one of the great modernist writers of the 20th century, along with James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. So we could see that in general he was just ahead of his time. He was trying to break through the traditional topics that were included in literature in his era. So he was really not after fame and selling books in general. In fact, right now I'm going to leave you with one of his famous quotes. Regarding the author, D.H. Lawrence was born on September the 11th, 1885, so he lived through the final years of the Victorian era. He lived also through the Edwardian era, and finally until 1930 at the time of his death. During his lifetime, however, he didn't get the credit he deserved. In fact, because of these Victorian era and Edwardian era values, his works were considered to be ahead of their time because the subject matter of his work also placed human experience and human nature as the center of his works. So in certain novels, for example, he included very graphic descriptions of sexual relationships and sexual intercourse, and that led to some of his works being banned in certain countries, including the United States. A novel of his was banned for 30 years, and in England he was also considered a pornographer because of these things. And now that the time has passed, critics consider him one of the great modernist writers of the 20th century, along with James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. So we could see that in general he was just ahead of his time. He was trying to break through the traditional topics that were included in literature in his era. So he was really not after fame and selling books in general.
Initially, it must be established that this class was developed within the scope of communicative approach. According to Zakim, it is a teaching approach that highlights the importance of real communication for learning to take place. In the communicative approach, real communication and interaction is not only the objective in learning, but also the means through which it takes place. Larson and Freeman define communicative language teaching as the one that aims broadly to apply the theoretical perspective of the communicative approach by making communicative competence the goal of language teaching and by acknowledging the interdependence of language and communication. About communicative competence, Brown establishes that it enables us to convey and interpret messages and to negotiate meanings interpersonally within specific contexts. Also, this lesson is created within the scope of the presentation, practice, and produce approach, which is an approach, according to Lambert, is an approach in which an instructor presents new language, provides students with exercise for structured practice of this new language, and then provides them with a further task-like exercises in order to give them a chance for more unstructured practice. Now let's talk about the class. The class is intended for students in the intermediate level, in the 9th grade or the 3rd year of high school. The topic is going to be modal verbs. The previous knowledge that they need to control this information is simple present, all verbs, verb to be, subject pronouns. The general objective is giving advice, expressing responsibility and needs. And the specific objectives we have using modal verbs to express recommendation, obligation and necessity in everyday situations, and students showing the ability to interpret language and situations that require the usage of modals. For the warm-up, the teacher, after greeting the students, will ask them to sit in groups of 3, and after that the teacher will write 3-column table on the board, including the words obligation, necessity and recommendation. After that, each group of 3 will be given an envelope including some pieces of paper with verbs on them, and then the students will proceed to categorize those 3 verbs, including them under each column. And after that, the teacher will tell the students to copy those verbs on their notebooks, because afterwards they will be used in a more advanced stage of the class. Here we can see a list of the verbs that will be on the pieces of paper inside the envelopes that the students will get and will then categorize on the board. For the development of the class, given that it is established as presentational practice and produce, we will first have that the students will be organized in a U shape, and then the teacher will introduce the new concept of the modal verbs using must, should, have to and ought to, specifying their usage according to the occasion. Once every modal is explained, the teacher will ask the students to orally build examples for each modal using the verbs categorized in the first part of the class, in the warm-up, that they copied in their notebooks. That counts as the presentation section of the class. For the practice part of the class, the teacher will provide the students with a worksheet containing the poem to Women as Far as I'm Concerned by D.H. Lawrence, and the worksheet will contain a little bit of information about the author so that the students have some background knowledge about him. Then the worksheet is divided in 3 sections: the pre-reading section that contains a list of words with the new vocabulary, the reading section that contains the poems per se, and finally the post-reading section that contains 2 comprehension open questions that are: what is the poem about? Do you like the poem? Why not? This section of the class will take about 10 minutes, and it will be done in a way that the students get the most out of the worksheet. For the final part of the development section of the class, which is the production section, the teacher will ask the students to change certain verses from the poem into sentences including modal verbs. Now, this is something that I like to do whenever I teach any function of the language, whether it is a conditional or relative clauses, etc. I like to teach my students to understand the origin of where this function comes from. So in this case, I would ask the students to, because the poem is written in such a way that it looks like a set of instructions, I would ask my students to withdraw from those instructions and to interpret the verses. And here we can see some examples of the verses transformed into modal verb sentences, and that would count as the end of the development section of the class, and transitioning into the closure and final wrap-up section of the class. For the closing session of the class, the teacher will use a song, Hey Jude by the Beatles, and he will hand out the students sheets of paper containing the lyrics so that they could finally relax and sing along to the music. This song would contain certain lyrics that could be transformed into model verb sentences, but that wouldn't be done in this section of the class. That would count as homework, or it could be used as the beginning of the next class, so that there is a hook and a transition that could help the students relate the two classes and keep the progression going on.
There are many ways in which this poem could be used in an EFL classroom. In this particular case, I selected to use it not as the backbone, but as a complementary tool to the class. Now, it depends on every teacher when it comes to selecting their resources in the way they could incorporate literature in the EFL classroom. Nowadays we live in a time where we have transcended in education, we have transcended the usage of specific approaches when it comes to teaching, whether it is structuralistic or audiolingual or etc., etc. Nowadays what we do is that we take little pieces of every different approach or method, and we take the most out of it and use it to our advantage. However, when it comes to teaching a language, there is no doubt that the communicative approach is still very useful today, because communication is essential to any language and to human beings for that matter. So it is something that must be encouraged, especially when learning a different language and a different culture. Now, something about the communicative approach is that it requires context whenever the communication is occurring. And literature provides that context, whether it is poetry, prose, or drama. Literature, because it is the usage of language in a creative and aesthetic way to represent reality, it provides that framework of context that could give us enough to be used in an EFL classroom. Now, poetry can be used to practice pronunciation, vocabulary, or intonation. Prose can be used to practice reading, comprehension, as well as writing for an analysis, for example. And drama is perfect to make the students role play and practice dramatizations. Whether or not you decide to include it, you have to be aware that as a teacher, it is the best way that you can make your students take the most out of literature. Finally, using literature as a backbone or as a resource, complementary tool for teaching is something that should be encouraged amongst all EFL teachers, since it provides an opportunity to help your students grow not only in the academic aspect but as people and have more critical thinking skills. Also, it should be encouraged among your students to make them integrate literature as a part of their learning process, activities, and everyday life, so that they can perpetuate the learning process and even accelerate it to some extent, but mostly so that they can also have a value, a cultural value to the different literary forms in the world. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it and learned a little bit more about the usage of literature in the EFL classroom.